This is Microeconomics lecture number 11 on perfect competition. And we're going to start our discussion with a discussion of the continuum of market structures, okay? And you see the two polar ends, perfect competition and monopoly, and we're going to go through them. In this lecture, we're just going to look at perfect competition. Mostly everything that we've talked about so far through the first 10 lectures really deals with competitive markets, perfectly competitive markets. It's only going to be a very minor alteration that's going to move us into the discussion of the other markets, which we'll knock off pretty quickly. And the basic minor alteration is that in perfect competition, the individual firm faces the demand curve. The demand curve for the industry is the same as the demand firm for the individual curve. That's not for the individual firm. That's not going to be the same for all of the what we'll loosely refer to as imperfect markets. Okay, to shorten so we don't have to say monopolistic competition every time. And so these imperfect markets are going to be a little bit different, and we'll deal with those specifically when we get to them. And that'll be in the next lecture. That'll be in lecture 12. We'll deal with monopolistic competition through monopoly and see why they're different. Basically, it's because for perfect competition, marginal revenue and the price are the same thing because the individual firm faces the demand curve of the industry. That's not true for imperfect markets. And so in imperfect markets, marginal revenue is not going to be the same as price. We'll deal with that when we get to it. What we ultimately are going to differentiate, we're going to differentiate these different types of markets, and largely the differentiation is going to be based on the amount of market power. Now, what we mean by market power, we want to be very specific here. What we mean by market power is the ability of an individual firm, an individual producer, to control the price of the market. Okay? In perfect competition, the individual firm has no market power whatsoever. They are what we refer to as price takers. Okay? And I'll explain why that is in just a minute. Now, as a result of this, a number of things come out. Okay, and when we get into the other markets, and this is kind of the diametric opposition, whereas in a perfectly competitive market, the individual firm has no market power. In a monopolistic market, the monopolist, which is one producer producing everything, is the same as the industry itself, and therefore they have complete absolute market power. And we'll look at how that works when we get to the discussion of imperfect markets. Now, one of the things that's going to run out of this, and we're going to go through why this is the case, in a perfectly competitive market, and the degree to which a market is perfectly competitive, profit becomes terminal in the short run, and we'll explain why that is shortly. Now, here we have the four different types of markets that we really look at. I include, in that continuum at the beginning, I include duopoly. Duopolies are pretty rare when I can't even come to bring one to mind. That's where you have two and only two producers of the product. But you see here we run down this declension of it. Okay, perfect competition as opposed to monopoly. These are our polar opposites. A very large number of firms. You have one. Here you have a few, and we'll define oligopoly a little bit more when we get to the discussion of imperfect markets. What defines an oligopolistic industry? Type of product, and this is one of the keys. In perfect competition, it says standardized. What that really means is uniform. There is no differentiation. Whereas in an oligopoly, it can either be differentiated or not differentiated. And again, we'll hold that off till imperfect competition. But the most classic example of an oligopoly, there are two classic examples of oligopolies that we'll ultimately talk about. The first is the very famous OPEC cartel. Well, that's a uniform product. One barrel of oil is the same as another barrel of oil. And the other is the Medellin and Cali cartels in cocaine distribution from South America. They have largely uniform products. There's some differentiation, but not much. In a monopoly, you have a unique product with no close substitutions. Monopolistic competition, the key to understanding the difference between the perfectly competitive market and the monopolistically competitive market is, in a monopolistically competitive market, the products are differentiated. You can tell the difference between them. Okay, like one of the things you see down here, these examples okay, you have uniform products in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, agriculture is a classic example of this. Mining is a classic example of this. Fishing, most of your primary industries are perfect, are examples of perfect competition. Okay, now what that means is that, one potato is the same as another potato. One ear of corn is the same as another ear of corn. One codfish is the same as another codfish. There's no difference. Okay, and this is why the individual firm has no market power. Okay, so for example, if you imagine if you will, a farmer's market. Okay, on a given Saturday or Friday in the summertime, all the local farmers go down to the market. Okay, well, if the market price is $2 for a dozen ear of corn, all of the producers have to match that market price. If any of them try to charge more, they won't sell anything at all. Okay, you'll just buy somebody else's because the products are essentially exactly the same. And so the products are standardized. The products are uniform. Same thing with a fish market. Same thing in mining. One lump of coal is the same as another. When we get into monopolistic competition, there is differentiation in the product. Okay, so a classic example here's some examples of monopoly. Anything, if you see something advertised, that's monopolistic competition. Farmers don't advertise. They don't advertise because they can't differentiate their product from other products. So, like, you see these, commercials for laundry detergent. Laundry detergent is monopolistic competition. There is differentiation of the products. And what they try to advertise is they try to sell their product as being better. That's the differentiation. Now, you see down here, one of the things, they give you examples of them. One of the things I take issue with is that they talk about the auto industry as being oligopolistic. There was a time when that was true. That was true until the early 1970s, when you had three basic large automobile producers in the United States. That's not really true anymore. Okay, if you look at the industry concentration of automobiles, it's not really true that they're oligopolistic anymore. It's not that there's only a few producers, because, in addition to Ford, Chrysler, and GM, you have Hyundai, you have Honda, you have Toyota, you have, and the largest market share is actually Toyota's as it works out. You have Nissan, and that's just the Japanese, and Hyundai is South Korean. But you also have the Europeans. You have Audi, you have Porsche, you have Mercedes, you have BMW. Okay, so I really take issue with the fact that they call the automobile industry oligopolistic. It's more monopolistic competition. Okay, and this gives you a rough rundown of it. Okay. The other thing is this conditions of entry. What we mean is entry barriers. That's one of the things that I mentioned at the outset, is that in perfect competition, there are really no entry barriers. Anyone can go and be a farmer. You just buy some land and buy some seed, and you can be a farmer. Hell, you can go out in your backyard and dig up, trench up the yard a bit, and till the soil and grow your own food. And if you wanted to, you could sell it at the local farmer's market. So there's virtually no barriers to entry. And as we go up in this continuum, we see that the entry barriers, and exit barriers for that matter, increase. Okay, and we'll deal with them when we get to imperfect competition, why these entry barriers increase and what the entry barriers are. Okay, and that's why I really don't like the way that they say relatively easy, significant obstacles, and blocked. We want to be a little bit more specific on why that's the case. Non-price competition, this is advertising, things like that. This is why we have none in perfectly competitive markets. Okay, so I want you to be able to understand the difference between a perfectly competitive market and an imperfectly competitive market. There are a few key things. First of all, in a perfectly competitive market, the products are uniform. They're all the same. Okay? As one potato is the same as another potato. In imperfect markets, they generally aren't, with the exception of oligopolies. They can be in oligopolies. Okay? And we'll deal with those when we get there. Control over price, that's market power. Again, in a perfectly competitive market, this is one of the defining features of a perfectly competitive market. The individual firm has no market power. They have to match the industry price. They can't make any changes. With monopolistic competition and the others, they have at least some leeway. With monopoly, they have complete market power. With monopolistic competition, they have some leeway. Okay, we talked about at some length the idea of substitute products, and one of the examples I used was Ford and Chevy. Well, that's true and that's not true. You know, if Ford raises its price, the demand for Ford will go down, the demand for Chevys will go up, but Ford can raise its price a little bit without that effect taking place. Okay, it's going to be weaker. Okay, the cross elasticity between Ford and Chevy is going to be weaker than the cross elasticity between two farmers selling potatoes. Okay, because their products are interchangeable. Ford and Chevy aren't exactly interchangeable. They're substitutes for each other. They perform effectively the same function, but there's enough differentiation that they can sustain a little bit of a price change. Okay, some people are very loyal to Ford. Some people are very loyal to Chevy. Again, in perfect competition, there are no or virtually no entry barriers. All right, and so there's the basic declension. And here we go again. I'm stressing this point over and over. Here are the characteristics of a perfectly competitive market. No control over prices. They have to take the industry price. Okay, this is why their marginal revenue curve is the same as demand. This is why marginal revenue and price are the same in a perfectly competitive market. Okay, no product differentiation. You have a large number of firms. You have no entry or exit barriers. Now, this is what we've been saying, and I just wanted to draw a graph of it. This is probably the simplest graph we've had this semester, half-mester. This is the demand curve of a perfectly competitive firm. You see, here's the demand curve. Now, what this means is that if our perfectly competitive firm changes price at all, they won't sell any units at all. If they try to increase price, demand will be zero. Okay? Simple enough? Now, this is the argument for why perfect competition is going to create efficiency. And we brought up the subject of efficiency when we brought up the idea of profit maximization. Okay? Now let's follow out this process, and on the next slide we'll discuss the process again. This is the basic economic process in perfectly competitive markets. And to the degree that a market is perfectly competitive, it will match this. To the degree that it becomes imperfect, the more imperfect the market, the less it's going to follow this process. Okay? So a monopolistic market doesn't follow this process at all. A perfectly competitive market follows it perfectly. Okay? The basic idea is this. You enter in the perfect, let's suppose we start with a perfectly competitive market that has profit. In fact, we'll look over here. Let's say this is where we start our perfectly competitive market. Here's the price. Price equals marginal revenue. Okay? For reasons that we've talked about already in this lecture. We've talked about the idea that the individual firm faces the industry demand curve. Okay? So price equals marginal revenue. Well, here's the marginal cost curve for that particular firm. All right. So when we begin, we have a price of here, a marginal cost here, and what we talked about in profit maximization is this area here, okay, is going to be our profit. With me so far? Okay. Well, because of this profit, it's going to attract additional producers. If there's profit to be made, more firms are going to enter into the industry to produce, to soak up some of that profit. When that happens, now we're back to what we talked about, I think, for the first time in like lecture 4, okay, on supply. Okay, when more firms enter the industry, the supply curve shifts outward, dropping the equilibrium price and quantity, okay, so lowering price from PE1 to PE2. The effect this is going to have is to lower the price and take away all of this profit. We dealt with this all when we were dealing with profit maximization. So this is largely a review, leaving you with this much profit. Well, that much profit is still profit, okay? So additional firms will continue to enter. This process will continue each time the price drops until you reach a point where the price equals marginal cost. Okay, right down here, the minimum marginal cost point, at which point you have allocative efficiency. What we mean by allocative efficiency is that producers are producing exactly the amount that society wants, okay, based on what society is willing to pay for it and what the producer can produce it for. All right, so that process continues. Now, in the long run, and I'll go over it now. I'm going to go over it in the next slide as well. Okay, so let's suppose, now let's follow out this process again, okay, so that we understand it. We start out here. Because we have this profit, more firms enter the industry, and it slides the supply curve outward to the right. That drops the price. When it drops the price, it reduces our profit maximizing production level. We still have some profit. This process continues until the price slides all the way down to where price equals marginal cost, the minimum level, okay? At which point, any firm that is not able to produce at that low marginal cost is going to fail, okay? And as they fail, the supply curve will then start to shift back up the demand curve, okay? When it shifts back up the demand curve, okay, from say E2 to E1, now the price is going to increase, profit will be made again. Once profit is made again, new firms enter the industry, the supply curve slides to the right. And so there is this constant process. As long as profit is to be made, new firms enter, supply drops, shifts out to the right and increases, dropping the price until the price gets to the point where it's the minimum level of marginal cost. Producers that can't produce at that level fail. Supply curve starts to slide back up this way. Okay, profit is made again. New firms enter, and this process continues ad nauseum. Okay, and the reason it's able to do this is because you have no entry barriers. It's very easy to enter into the industry as a competitor. If there are entry barriers, okay, such as we have in monopolistic competition, or such as we have in oligopoly, or such as we have in monopolies, okay, this process isn't going to happen like that. New firm, it's more difficult in imperfect competition. It's more difficult for firms to enter into the industry and to produce, and so this phenomenon's not going to be as pronounced. It'll still happen. It still happens, but it's not as pronounced. Okay, there's not as much fluctuation, and that's why I introduced this continuum from perfect competition to monopoly. Okay, the closer it is to perfect competition, the more this phenomenon is going to happen. And because the more this phenomenon is going to happen, the more efficient the industry. Okay? The only time you actually achieve pure economic efficiency is in a perfectly competitive industry. Once you move away from that, you become progressively less efficient. And so the least efficient of them all is monopoly. Okay? Which is why I despise monopolies. Most economists despise monopolies. Although what we're going to see when we discuss imperfect competition is there are reasons for them. Okay, the only real reason we have for monopoly is a natural monopoly, and we'll deal with that when we get there. Okay, but I want you, this is going to be critical that we understand this process. Why it is that a perfectly competitive industry moves towards economic efficiency. Okay, that's allocative efficiency. And we think of allocative efficiency as short-run efficiency. Okay, when we deal with productive efficiency, ultimately price will equal minimum marginal cost. That's allocative efficiency, and that will equal the lowest average total cost, which is long-run efficiency. And we'll deal with that later. Okay, so here again, just to recap, is this process. Limited barriers to entry allow firms to enter and exit the market. If it's profitable, more firms enter, supply shifts outward, this lowers prices. Okay? And then from our profit maximization graphics, what we just looked at and what we just discussed was this lower prices is going to yield lower profits. The process continues until all profit in the short run evaporates and the P equals marginal cost. Minimum marginal cost, I should say. Now in the long run, firms that can't produce, where the price equals the marginal cost, leave the industry, the supply shifts inward, prices rise, profits increase, new firms enter, As new firms enter, the price drops, profit is absorbed, etc., and the process continues ad nauseum. And so that concludes this very short lecture, and then the next one we'll get into imperfect competition, where we'll have a lot more to say.